In 1976, these two brothers negotiated a deal that made them $800 million in pure profit from the NBA without ever being involved with the NBA. They didn't own an NBA team. They didn't invest in the NBA. They didn't provide the NBA with any services, and they most definitely didn't play in the NBA. And yet, the NBA ended up paying them $800 million. So this is the story of the greatest sports deal of all time. The NBA is the biggest basketball league in the world today. And more importantly, it's the only major men's basketball league in America.
LeBron to himself. LeBron James. Opening round series. Morant. Oh! A jawbreaker!
But that wasn't always the case. Back in the 1960s, the NBA had some major competition from another basketball league in America. This league was called the ABA, the American Basketball Association, and people loved this league. The ABA was created in 1967, and by 1974, our main characters, these two brothers, Daniel and Ozzie Silna, decided to buy one of the franchises in the ABA. That franchise was the Carolina Cougars. And the grand price of buying this ABA franchise back in 1974 was a cool $1 million. But before I tell the rest of the story, there's some important context to establish. Even though the ABA was launched 21 years after the NBA, it really began to get popular. So for starters, games in the ABA were a lot of fun, and they had more scoring compared to the NBA. The ABA came up with the now famous three-point line. So I guess we can actually say that Steph Curry might not have the legacy of being the greatest shooter ever if it wasn't for the ABA. The ABA also came up with the slam dunk contest that's incredibly popular today as well. And even the red, white, and blue basketball that was used in the ABA was iconic.
It really threw me for a loop. It took me close to half a season to focus back on my regular game. Every time I shot that basketball, I was watching that ball in flight and thinking, oh, what pretty colors.
In terms of stars, the ABA also had superstars of its own, including the legendary Julius Erving, who we all might know as Dr. J. And of course, there was Moses Malone as well. And for some time, there was actually a chance that the ABA could go on to become America's biggest basketball league. But for all of the fun that was being had on the court in the ABA, the league was really struggling behind the scenes as far as business was concerned. The main reason was that the league didn't have the lucrative TV contracts that was necessary to generate revenue for the league and also for its franchises. And so in 1976, something major happened in American basketball. The ABA and the NBA merged to form one league, which now we all know as the NBA. And this merger of two leagues provided a stage for what then became the greatest sports deal of all time. So here's how it went down. When the merger happened, one of the conditions that was necessary for it to happen was that only 4 of the franchises that played in the ABA would be accepted into and compete in the NBA. Now those 4 franchises were the New York Nets, which we all now know of course today as the Brooklyn Nets, the Denver Nuggets, the Indiana Pacers, and the San Antonio Spurs. But after those 4 franchises were accepted into the NBA, that left 3 other existing ABA franchises, and the newly merged league had to figure out what to do with them. So the plan was to agree a buyout with this team, which basically meant that they would be paid to disband their franchises and essentially stop existing. Now this was important because the point of the merger was for the NBA to become the only existing major basketball league in America. And so possibly the idea behind buyouts was to ensure that these 3 franchises somehow couldn't kickstart their own league down the line at some point in the future. Now, these 3 franchises were the Virginia Squires, the Kentucky Colonels, and the Carolina Cougars, the team owned by our main characters, the Silna Brothers. Now, at the time, the Silna Brothers had moved the Carolina Cougars to St. Louis, and they had renamed it the St. Louis Spirits. The first team to get wiped out after the merger was the Virginia Squires, but that was because they went bankrupt right before the merger was finalized, so that problem was solved. The next team to go was the Kentucky Colonels, but they didn't go bankrupt. Instead, they agreed a $3 million deal to fold up and stop operating as a franchise. Now here's where it gets interesting. The St. Louis Spirits were offered the same $3 million deal to stop operating as a franchise. And this offer had come only 2 years after the Silna Brothers had paid $1 million to buy the franchise. So they were essentially being offered 3 times the fee they had paid to buy the franchise. That's a sweet deal, and most people would absolutely do that deal. I know I would do that deal. But the Silna brothers are not most people. They didn't do that deal. Instead, they asked for a very different type of deal. So here's what their deal looked like. First, the Silna brothers asked that any of their players at the St. Louis Spirits who got drafted by another NBA team, they will get paid for that. And this turned out to be about $2 million paid to the Silna brothers in upfront cash because some of the players ended up getting drafted by other NBA teams. But on top of that, they also asked to receive 14% of the annual share of TV revenues that the 4 former ABA teams would receive from visual media rights. And visual media rights essentially means television revenue. And now to the crazy part of the deal. The Silnas had one key clause in the contract, which was to state that the share of TV money that would be paid to them would be paid in perpetuity, which basically means forever. But the funny thing about this is that at the time, the 4 ABA franchises, the Nets, the Denver Nuggets, the Indiana Pacers, and the San Antonio Spurs, were receiving $0 in TV money. And so for the first 3 years, the Silna brothers actually also received $0 based on their clause as well. But then in 1979, when the ABA franchises started to receive some TV money, the Silna brothers ended up getting a reported $200,000 in that year. But that was only the beginning, because the NBA started to take off in the 1980s thanks to huge stars like Michael Jordan, Larry Bird, and Magic Johnson. So everyone wanted to watch these stars play, and this meant the NBA started to make some real money from television revenue. By the late 1990s, the NBA's TV revenues had gone absolutely crazy, which was great news for the Silna brothers. So first, let's take a look at how the NBA's TV revenues have changed over the years, starting in the late 1990s, and then try to break down how much the Silna brothers made from their clause in that deal. Between 1998 and 2001, the NBA was making about $600 million per year in TV revenues. Between 2002 and 2007, this number had climbed to $760 million. Between 2008 and 2015, the NBA was making $930 per year. And then from 2016 to 2025, the NBA is estimated to receive about $2.6 billion per year in TV revenue. So now that you get how the NBA's TV revenues have gone absolutely crazy, let's take a look at what that meant for the Silna brothers. Before I go on, if you're still watching at this point, how about you give the video a thumbs up, and of course, if you haven't subscribed, do so you get to watch more cool videos that I make every week. Now let's get back to the story. Remember, the deal was for the Silna brothers to receive about 14% of the share of TV revenues that the 4 former ABA teams would receive. Now, when they agreed to this deal in 1976, that 14% was pretty much $0. But the Silna brothers had a very good idea of what would happen in the future. And things look very different today compared to 1976. So let's try to break down how much the Silna brothers ended up making thanks to their super smart deal. So according to Sports Illustrated, the Silna brothers received about $500,000 in 1980 from their deal. By 1987 though, they were receiving about $1 million per year. By the year 2000, they were receiving about $10 million per year. And if you think that's crazy, by 2011, the Silna brothers are receiving about $17.5 million, and by 2014, reportedly the Silna brothers received $20 million in that year. And so in total, between 1976 when they struck the deal and 2014, the Silna brothers had made roughly $300 million in payout from the NBA, thanks to their crazy contract clause back in the 70s. Now, anyone who looks at these numbers will come to the same conclusion. This is an absolutely crazy deal. But also remember that a part of the deal was that the Silna brothers would get their cut every year forever. But these former ABA teams obviously soon became frustrated by having to pay out huge money to these 2 guys who were doing absolutely nothing for them. And so the NBA and the former ABA teams tried to buy out the Silna brothers from their deal twice. First in 1979 when some cash started to roll in, and then in 1995 when that cash turned into a huge flood. But the Silna brothers did what anyone who was making a ton of money without raising a finger would do. They showed absolutely no interest in negotiating, and they said, no, we like our deal, we'll keep our deal. And as you can imagine, the NBA obviously had really gotten tired of seeing tens of millions of dollars flowing to these 2 brothers who were not involved in the league in any way, but they got money every year. And so they tried again to buy out the two brothers in 2014. But it was clear that to even get the two brothers to negotiate, the NBA had to go big. And I mean really big. Now, after several meetings with the brothers and their lawyers and the NBA and the former ABA teams, the Silna Brothers finally agreed on a buyout deal for, wait for it, $500 million. That $500 million payment from the buyout and the estimated $300 million that they had received in annual payments between 1976 and 2014 meant that the Silna Brothers ultimately made $800 million from the NBA without as much as lifting a finger. And that's why this deal is easily the greatest sports deal of all time.